Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is...
So I'm in Scotland just now. I'm enjoying a bit of slow time in lockdown. Normally I'm traveling all over the world, so I've been able to come back here and catch up all the things that I plan to do, but I never have the time for. So it's quite nice. I'm feeling that sense of rooting into kind of Scottish winter, slowing down. So actually quite enjoying it for now. So yeah.
Terrific. Well, let's dive right in. Do you think sexuality is a kind of line of developmental intelligence? Do you think it moves through stages?
It definitely does, yeah. Good question. I like how you dive in there. It's like a kind of first. If I just met you in a bar, I would say you're being a little bit forward. But, it's an interesting thing because to use the word intelligence, I know in Integral they use multiple intelligences, because then it actually makes me feel, well, it does have a certain intelligence to it, really, doesn't it? It's very close to what we would call that evolutionary drive. And there does feel to be something behind that. There does feel like there's a intelligence behind it. But for sure, there's stages. There's different stage models. There's capacities that you can grow within. One of the, I guess, most basic ways to look at it would be from Rajneesh Osho had this idea of how it unfolds in stages, and also kind of like from childhood into adulthood. So there would be beginning with the self. So there's that kind of like autosexuality, where you have that sexuality to your own body in the younger years. And as you grow up, there's a more kind of homoerotic sexuality. And sexuality in this thing, it doesn't always mean acts in the bedroom, but it's like what we're attracted to and where our desires are. So there would be a kind of interest in the same pole. It's a little bit different from what you are, but it's still quite close because it's the same. So if your sexuality, if your polarity was masculine, then you'd want to spend time with other little boys and hang out with them. You wouldn't be so interested in girls at that point. And then there becomes a heterosexual kind of like thing where it's moving to, heterosexual is the wrong word actually. It would be moving to the polar opposite. So then there's a growth out beyond what's similar to you. And it's that kind of expanding into the universe to include more and more. And I think that's also quite similar to the stages in the spiral of what Ken Wilber would point out. So
all those phases sound like there's an increasing orientation toward otherness.
Yeah.
So then what's next? What's our next step in that process? What's even more other?
Beautiful question. And I want to clarify something, because like Osho arose in a particular culture and tradition, and so that doesn't exclude homosexuality. It might sound in that sense like, well, okay, that's saying like homosexuality is kind of lesser, it's not so evolved. And that's definitely not the case, because it's to do with polarity, which would be what you'd feel inside in terms of masculine and feminine. So if that polarity inside, in most kind of homosexual relationships, there's still polarity, there's still a playing out of one or the other. So it wouldn't exclude that, but it would be going kind of to the polarity that felt more other in some way. So God. the next step is God, isn't it? In whatever, probably a few stages in between there, but
Theosexual.
I like that.
I was going to say, this thing about homo and heterosexuality is interesting, and like you say, a lot of people who opened up these ideas for us in the early and mid 20th century were rooted in a little bit older concept. Although the words themselves, if you unpack them, sort of have, the sameness and the otherness in there.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a bit of a, I don't know if it's a tension, but there's a diversity of expression among people who are involved in spiritualized and developmental sexuality, where some of them are looking at the real diversity of people's sexual identities and saying, I don't know if we even need old-fashioned polarization notions anymore. I don't know if two is really a good way to think about this. But on the other hand, it is the classic tantric way to think about it. Masculine and feminine, like two poles of electricity to get a current flowing. Yeah. So is it outdated? Is it part of the essential mechanics of the universe? Or is it just a super convenient way for humans to think about it?
Oh my God, all three. Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can see with identity politics and how those things are coming out nowadays that it's not so fashionable or politically correct in a way to use these terms, and people can potentially take offense at that. And I wonder how much of that is in the postmodern realm, really. I wonder if that's where we might speak about this a bit more later, but Tantra really at this stage is really emerging in this postmodern level. And so what is Tantra and what is postmodernism is very often getting confused in some way, because I see Tantra as being able to run through all the stages. It is really useful. It doesn't need to be offensive, because you can use any polarity. You can use yin and yang. It doesn't always cover the same bases. But it's not that we throw out yin and yang just because there's a whole diversity of that in us. It's like also the nervous system. We have the parasympathetic and we have the sympathetic, and an awareness of that polarity and how you can move between them and how you can use them is really helpful. So maybe we could come up with different terms, but to throw out polarity completely just because it might offend us, I think would be a sad thing. So I think it definitely has its uses. I can see traditionally what happened was people looked around them and they kind of took the thing of masculine and feminine as a great way to show those differences, and they put a whole lot of ideas within that. That's not man or woman, obviously, but masculine and feminine. And we have both within us, but it's just a way to help understand how to use polarity in a way that clarifies situations. Yeah.
So postmodernity has these interesting aspects that all seem to involve folding in things that were left out of modernity or challenging some of the categories that we've been using.
Yeah.
And so we're coming out of the mental identity back into the body, folding in sexuality and topics that might have been taboo or ostracized in the past, but also challenging these basic dichotomies and dualisms we've traditionally used. So it's interesting that all goes together. And you mentioned that, Tantra might look a certain way through that cultural lens. How does it look through all of them in a sense? Like, what's your notion of how Tantra has applied to different cultural epochs?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but I could maybe mention...
If you have a gist or, what's your sense?
Yeah. Well, I can say from more classical Tantra, and that's to kind of lump a whole lot of different various things together. The main focus on that was waking up practices. So it was really about waking up in some sense. That was the main thing. It didn't really include so much to do with relationships or growing up, but that was the focus of it. So everything you would be doing in that would be to help expand your consciousness and to go deeper into state experiences. With Neo-Tantra, which came along with Osho, he was kind of a bit of a bridge. So he had one foot rooted in those classical Tantra systems, like the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra. He drew on a lot. He had a beautiful book on that, the Book of Secrets, which shows all these meditations. And at the same time, he was inviting in a lot of Western psychotherapists and modalities. So there was this kind of really beautiful synthesis that was happening there. Then there's kind of more the new age Tantra, which is quite postmodern. And that's really what's quite diverse at the moment. And it's difficult to know because all these things are just called Tantra. But within that, then it's much more, it's to do with kind of sacred sexuality. It's to do with relationships. It's to do with maybe shadow work. It's to do with therapies. And so it kind of expands out into all these other areas, which is a really great kind of, expansion. But what it seems to lack or seems to have dropped a bit is the waking up path. So Tantra becomes about how can I have better orgasms, or how can I get on better with my partner or relationships? And the thing that's kind of forgotten might be the waking up aspect of that. So there is a kind of movement for an integral Tantra, actually. This is what I'm starting to see emerge. This is what I'm really interested in. And that's using things like Ken Wilber's theory and other integral kind of models to help make sense really of the new age Tantra, because it's a bit bitty. It's like a bit from here and it's a little bit from there, but it doesn't really have that overarching kind of meta theory. And integral theory feels like a really good meta theory for that. So I'd say that's the cutting edge as I see it at the moment, which is just starting to emerge.
Yeah, I like that. I have a similar sense that there's a space of the different alternatives that people have been playing with, and a way of holding all that together and balancing it out so that we can go forward into a much broader view of it. It's very intriguing.
Definitely. Yeah.
Coming back to this notion of sexual energy as polarized energy, I have two different mental images about polarities. One is like an electrical current, where it's polarized from one end toward the other, and you need both of these in order to establish that current. And the other image is like walking or balancing by alternating between two different things in order to achieve a kind of functional balance. When you think of polarization, are you thinking of, switching back and forth and playing them off against each other, or are you thinking of establishing a current that moves in a particular direction?
I would say both. Yeah, again, I think that's the pulsation between that polarity is what helps things grow and integrate. I'm a didactic teacher in Biodanza, and within that, then the theoretical model of that is they have different lines of development. Sexuality is one of them, but the more that you're able to move between these, and they use the nervous system, like the kind of, which they'd say like the sympathetic nervous system of coming into identity, kind of forming yourself, and then the dissolution of that into more oceanic experience through the parasympathetic relaxed nervous system. Over time, that starts to integrate everything together, so you get more and more order. So I really like that sense, and I know like within the spiral, there's that sense of in spiral dynamics of that integration, that pulsation between each side, and each side time it becomes a bit more ordered. You can solve some of the problems of the previous stages. So that eros is really kind of helping to create this larger integration. I also feel like in terms of working with polarity, in terms of work like David Deida's work, in terms of partner work, that's really kind of a really good kind of idea to have this idea of the battery. So instead of kind of neutralizing everything, you're accentuating those qualities, whether you call it masculine or feminine or whatever, but that's what creates the buzz. That's the more the polarity is there, the more the juice is, and that juice is the energy that we have for transcendence. Like if you have a kind of neutral flat battery, you're not going to have so much you can use in terms of transformation, but the more charged that is, the more stuff comes up to work with, obviously, but it gives more juice to the practice, more juice to that awakening. So
that's intriguing. I have a few more questions about differentials, but you mentioned movement and the nervous system, and those are two things that I connect with the work of like a guy like Wilhelm Reich, who really emphasized the two halves of the nervous system and the ability to pulsate and move freely. And he also had a lot of thoughts about, armor and contraction and the immobility of the body. So In your view, what do bodies have to be able to do in order to participate in a healthy, rich, and evolving sexuality?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that is a growth in itself. I think we all have these different kind of armorings and cultural conditionings imposed on that, and I think it's not maybe so much that they have to do, but I think there is a path of growth there, of reintegrating ourselves and reintegrating the body. You talk in Biodanza about dissociations, so we'd have like the motor body, how that is able to move in certain ways, but how connected is that to the affective body, to our feelings, or to the subtle bodies? So the more we can start to integrate those things, the more free we are to feel more of the cosmos, I would say. And I think this is a great, I was saying what integral theory is a really fantastic thing for Tantra, and I think it's going to be really useful. I also see Tantra and things like Biodanza as really key for integral, actually, because there's a lot of armchair philosophers out there, and a lot of mental knowledge, but it's actually really bringing it into the body and into life and directly experiencing that, which Tantra and Biodanza and other practices, they really know that really well. So
You mentioned David Deida a few minutes ago, and one of the things I always found interesting about his ideas was that different layers of your body could have different gender polarizations. You could have
yeah,
a subtle gender, a gross gender, a causal gender. How do ideas like that sit with you?
I like that. Yeah, I mean, he talked about a sexual essence, but I like the idea that you can actually have that in different ways. So his classical thing was that we've built that armor around ourselves, and it wasn't that there's one polarity or one thing that's right, but it's more like if you've built an armor of a kind of sexual identity outside, which isn't really in alignment with what's there on the inside, then that's going to stand in the way. So it's to dissolve that, to come to the truth, rather than whatever cultural conditions have been put upon you. I hadn't thought about it so much in terms of gross, subtle, and causal, but that makes a lot of sense, for sure. Yeah.
That idea of a difference between our superficial armored character and our inner essence makes a lot of sense in a culture that values individual authenticity. But does it make the same kind of sense in like cultures where the survival of the group over time is a greater priority? Like, are there things in your mind, are there legitimate ways where individual sexual authenticity needs to be culturally suppressed under certain conditions in order to favor the group, even if it's at the expense of the individual's authenticity?
I mean, it does make sense in terms of spiral dynamics that all these kind of layers of the spiral are always going to be there. There's always people growing up from beige onwards. So it does make sense that might be part of the thing. That might be part of the growth. I wonder how it's almost like we need to have experiences of structure to then reject that structure later on and feel the liberation from that. So I think it will be there, whether it's, maybe it's not even a question of is it right or wrong. I think it just is. I think that just is part of the growth, isn't it?
There's an interesting balance between ideas of sexual essence and ideas like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Timothy Leary's ideas on these subjects, where people receive an early life imprint at a very deep neurological level, and that early tribes would intentionally, take young children and let them have sex with the village prostitute or, the temple prostitute or something, to keep their sexual interest within the unit and the characteristic of the tribe, to make that be their preference. So, to what extent are we really flexible and our circumstances determine our sexual identity? And to what degree is it somehow inbuilt in a real essence of some kind?
Well, I think that's interesting because, I mean, obviously we have cultural kind of conditions which have set up like this is, even with homosexuality and heterosexuality, maybe even 20, 30 years ago. And yet you'd still have people feel like, well, that cultural norm of what our sexual identity is supposed to be doesn't resonate with me. So I think that's always been seen through time. So it does transcend that culture. And at the same time, it's nature and nurture, isn't it? There's this, our nurture does impact us a lot. They were talking Biodanza about fetishes, where like early imprints of where our body was aroused, but something else was happening. Maybe our mother walked in and she had red shoes and they were clonking on the floor in a certain way. And then later in life, we need to have someone walking on us with red high-heeled shoes, and obviously to get that orgasmic thing. So I think maybe different kinks or different things get imprinted on our nervous system in that way. And there are a lot of people who work with those very specific kinks in a way to, in different stages, sometimes just to get off, sometimes to feel what the emotional component is underneath them and drop down and meditate. And sometimes it's really just to open that up. It could be a place where our sexuality is being contracted around a certain thing, and just to really experience that and hold it in our awareness might move a lot of energy through our body and open us to some wider experience. So I feel it's both. I don't know.
Both, and I don't know. I think that's an answer that will resonate with most of the viewers of this. I mean, it's interesting to think for me about how plastic a sexual energy can be. It seems to be able to get into all kinds of areas, and like you say, it could be moved from a person's body to some red shoes they saw. And then there's an open question about whether the appropriate thing to do is to work on freeing that energy from the projection into the shoes, or incorporating it as part of the distinctive richness of my own weird being.
Yeah.
So I guess behind that is a question like, in our culture and in our individual lives, do we sexualize too many things or not enough things?
I do like that. I mean, very often when people try and describe what is sexuality, like, is Tantra just sex, basically? And there's different answers to that, because you could say, well, no, sex is just, it's a very small part of it, it's included, but there's much more going on. Like the classical texts like Vijnana Bhairav Tantra, it's 112 meditations, maybe 6 of them are related to the sexual act in some way. Another way to look at it is that everything is sexual. When you take sexuality to mean more than just what's happening in the bedroom, but your relationship to each and every moment, to everything that's arising, then you could say, yeah, Tantra is about sexuality, because it's about each and everything that arises in each moment. So what was your question again? I realized I went off a bit then.
There's a curiosity for me around whether too many things are sexualized or not enough things, because on the one hand, there is this tantric idea that an energy, not necessarily sexual, but whatever's underneath sexual energy, should be experienced very diversely, maybe even as the totality of the cosmos.
Yeah.
There's this other notion that maybe a lot of our individual sexual problems are that our sexual energy is in places where it really shouldn't be. It's not in our sexual life. It's taking over our political life or our religious life, or it's making us behave like maniacs in some area where it really shouldn't be. So, like, it's very hard to corral sexual energy.
Yeah.
Should it be more diversified, or should it get back into its spot?
That's it. I can imagine these sexual priests with whips kind of like get back there, probably wearing some red high heel shoes. Well, yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's, I don't really like shoes, so I think it's what works for people. Really, it's like if there's fixations and addictions, like, I think the question is it serving me? So a lot of sexuality has actually come into the head. So when people are watching pornography and various things, it's become a mental process. The chemicals, it's all happening within the brain. rather than within the full body. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you start to shame that, that shame is part of the thing that also helps drive that addiction. It doesn't really support it to say that it's wrong, but it's great to just see, well, there's a possibility here to be more embodied. A lot of us might not have, maybe that's the way we learned our sexuality, was through pornography, through magazines or the internet. And so we've already trained our nervous system in quite patterned ways. And those patterns will persist unless we kind of slow down and do something to help open that up in a way. So I don't feel there's something wrong or right about it, but there's an invitation to go deeper and to become more embodied, for sure.
It's an interesting thing to say, whatever works for a person.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's hard to define what works is. You're saying it has something to do with depth and embodiment, but what else in your mind would signify to an individual that whatever they're doing sexually is in fact working for them?
Well, I would say, like, are you happy? Do you feel satisfied, content? Are you unhappy? Are you miserable? Because when we're talking about pornography, I mean, there's very interesting things that happen around ejaculation and neuroscience where, when I first learned this, I was amazed. Like, actually, after a man comes, then there's a peak of dopamine, and it drops down. It drops down for about 17 days, actually, to kind of, before it starts to come back normal. And there's other kind of hormones involved in that, but just to see that kind of addictive nature of that, especially when it's being used more in a mental way, there is some suffering around that most teenagers, for me, like, I was probably depressed since I was like 13 or 14. When you start this whole journey, you realize actually you've been depressed. A lot of men are actually depressed because that's where the neurotransmitters have been, but it becomes normal. So I think starting to have an awareness of how we can use our sexual energy and move that through the body can open up into all sorts of other areas in life. It can change our relationships. It can change our work, our general state of being and happiness, our meditation. So I think it is a key thing to really look at what are our habits and our patterns here.
What's the difference between ejaculation and orgasm, and how important is it to learn to make distinctions about things like that in order to have a richer and more open sexual existence?
So again, I would really take away the thing of shame, because that's the thing that gets, and we're all learning and growing like any path. And normally the orgasm and ejaculation or peak experience in a woman is tied together. However, it doesn't need to be the case. It's really just a movement of energy through our bodies, and you can separate those two things out. So it's possible to have full body orgasm, full energy moving through us without the need to ejaculate in that moment. It's not that ejaculation is wrong. There's also different studies saying that we have a natural cycle, a little bit like how women have a natural menopause cycle. Men also have a similar thing where there's a kind of good time to be ejaculating and maybe a time where you feel like you'll lose energy a little bit in sense of that. So it's bringing awareness, and I think it's almost like a meditation practice, because really in that sense, if you're in a masculine body or masculine polarity, then it's that kind of embrace of the feminine. It's how much of the feminine can we take in before we go unconscious and it slips out in some way. So you could almost do a kind of Vipassana, maybe this is the next level for Goenka, to kind of just watch the kind of aversion or the cravings, but just see how you can just sit with that. So bringing awareness into any of those things slows it down, and we start to notice where is the automatic following of the energy, or where can we hold masculine and feminine together, energy and awareness together, without falling into another. So that would be in Tantra, that's sublimation. When they're talking about masculine and feminine, it's really energy and awareness. Normally, we choose one or the other. We choose practices of meditation, we just stay in awareness. and we kind of negate the kind of feminine. We don't take that in because we see the temptation in that, or we just follow the energy all the time without the awareness. But when you can hold both of them together, that would be when sublimation happens and transformation. That's when something deeper or wider than the two of those begins to integrate.
Is that your notion of what the orgasm ideally is? Although maybe we don't want to throw a word ideally in there because it has too much should to it, but the merger of awareness and energy.
Yeah. And they would talk about that in Tantra. They have the word Mahamudra, which mudra is like a gesture in hands, but it's like the great gesture. And that would be where there's this merging with the whole. So you talked about stages of sexuality, and that would be that stage, the great orgasm, where you actually, your sense of self kind of dissolves into something much larger and wider than yourself.
So other than slowing down and being mindful and observing the tendency of your energy to escape from the process, what could people voluntarily do to enhance the experience of the merger of awareness and energy?
Well, breathing is a fantastic tool for that because it has both polarities in that. There's the in-breath of life, and then there's also the letting go of death in the out-breath. So becoming more conscious of the breath actually helps us to become conscious of that within us. So in Tantra, there's lots of breathing exercises between partners where you might do alternative breaths, or you might breathe in a particular way, or you might just come into the same flow of life, just watching your breath move together at the same time. And in that, there's a kind of slowing down from the gross physical reality, and we start to come more into subtle and maybe causal experiences. So I think that's where Integral has a great map using those states for a lot of New Age Tantra practices, which are already kind of doing that, but might not know it. So
what's your take on subtle energy? Is it just a really good metaphor for how our system behaves? Is it a way of talking about bioelectromagnetism in the body? Or is it the presence of some other regime of energy from some other domain of the world?
So I would say like the subtle energy is the dreamlike energy. So there is that movement from causal into gross form. And I think it's a kind of process of manifestation, how something comes out from nothing. So I always feel like the subtle is that which is almost. It's not quite solid yet. And it includes emotions. So very often people play with energy in Tantra and kind of finding these things. You're staring at someone's face for a long time, it starts to dissolve, and really the solidness of the universe begins to dissolve, and that is a reality in itself. That we can see things as solid, but we know through physics and things it's not exactly the truth, it's a truth. And so it's, I think it's a playing through those dimensions. And one of the parts that I often find that's maybe lacking is the awareness of affectivity, of emotional states. It's not just energetic, but it's like, where does the heart, where does that sense of compassion? And I always feel, maybe wrongly, but I always feel that's there in the subtle energy as well, to have more of an awareness that we're not just doing a physical act that's grinding up and down against each other or playing with energy, but there are emotions involved. And that's where real intimacy starts to occur for me.
I love the idea of an energy of almosts. And it makes me curious about the role of thresholds, in sexuality, and how important do you think it is to be more attentive to delicate thresholds and approaches and almosts in experience of sexuality?
One of the meditations from the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra, as it's translated into English, is at the beginning of sexual encounter, have awareness at the start and thus avoid the embers at the end. And it's really just pointing to that. It's really pointing to that kind of like just slowing everything down and really seeing what's happening, because it's the most curious thing that we don't really ever really questioned that much. This sexual drive or the sexual urge that we have, it's like at the core of our being. And so when we actually start to get curious about that, well, why is that? Because mentally it's ridiculous. If you didn't have that experience and you're just looking at it mentally, you would think that is the most ridiculous thing in the world. But it's the slowing down of that helps us to begin to know ourselves more. What are these innate forces that are driving us? What is this thing? So becoming curious in that is really interesting, and it's deeply spiritual. Some of the most profound insights for me are really just kind of witnessing that energy. Why is that? What is this thing that's driving me in this way?
I think that's one of the places where it really resonates well with developmental models of complexity, because you have to have more observations and see more nuances in order to enter into a richer understanding of what's going on. And that's a parallel to those growth models of complexity. Where I used to see one thing, now I see 10 different things interacting.
Exactly. Yeah, I really feel that. Yeah.
You mentioned breathing and breathing together. And I wonder, without laying a should on everybody equally, what sorts of physical practices are really useful for people, prior to sexuality, to be as present and enlivened and ready? Do you have dietary ideas? Are there exercises and stretches, and how, what do you need to be able to do? Are you worried about people being too full, or, what's adequate physical preparation for an interesting, rich love life?
Well, I mean, you could add everything you've mentioned and more. You could add in there, but I don't think it's necessary. I think your intention to do that with a partner is enough at any time. You can just drop into you of course, diet, like being aware of doing pranayama exercises. It's also working with the nervous system. It's working with it's Ida and Pingala in the Kundalini system, and it's helping to clear the body. But really it's about intimacy. I think if anything else, it's about, like, that sexual act is a way for us to remove a mask and actually show up for other people. If we're too in the head about trying to do everything right, then that kind of keeps the mask on. When we can just relax in that and just slow down, then everything begins to shift. So, I mean, there are definitely practices people can do together and individually. One individual one, which I would actually really recommend, is self-pleasuring or self-love. So this helps to repattern the nervous system when we've all been kind of taught to be kind of quiet and hunched over in a bathroom somewhere, kind of holding our breath. It's like that's what we've trained our nervous system for orgasm. Then actually being able to spread the energy to the whole of the rest of our body. It takes us away from the beggar position where we think that the love or the pleasure or something is dependent on someone else. So it definitely helps in terms of relationship, but also just ourselves showing up more as an emperor rather than a beggar. Is that we're already full, and then what we have when we meet someone else, we're able to share that rather than there being some kind of hook or needing something for them. So self-pleasuring, self-love is a really beautiful practice, and it can be gross, it can be pleasuring, as I named it, touching the whole body, getting coconut oil, making sound, using our breath, doing all the things that we didn't do as teenagers, actually maybe moving our body, going into different positions. There was a great one from Joseph Carreno when he was helping people who had pornography addictions and what to do. Well, the first thing he would say people to do is, well, watch the porn, masturbate as you normally do, but just stand up or maybe try dancing, because already that's a shift. So that repatterning is great, and you can do that on the gross level. You can also touch yourself in a way that gives, in the subtle level, that starts to give meaning to your emotions and energy. You can play with energies in your body, but can you also give this sense into your cells of the body that you're loved, that you're cared for? So it's not, again, dependent on mother or father or partner to have this, but actually you are the universe being able to give this to yourself. Or it can, like, how deep can your touch go? Can it also touch into, from a causal realm, can you touch into your soul? Can you touch into various messages in your body and really listen to them? So that's one I would say that's super helpful and useful. Definitely.
Yeah, I love that. I like two things about that. One is this, if you can't contact love and pleasure in yourself, then you're probably not going to be able to contact it even in sexuality. And then no matter how much sex you have, you're still going to feel like you're starving.
Yeah, completely.
On the other hand, it has this, like opening out of that contracted posture also has real significance for our physiology, because, when we try to treat sexuality from a pharmaceutical dimension, most of that treatment is just encouraging blood flow. It's what things like Viagra do, is cause more blood flow. But that's also what happens when you move, when you open, when you feel into your body. Right, that was about physical preparation. But what about conversational relationship preparation? What sorts of conversations do you think people need to have in order to really move their own sex life forward in a way that's satisfying for them?
Sorry, the audio went off a little bit in the middle of that question. I think.
What's your sense of the kinds of conversations that, say, a couple should have in order to facilitate their, collective movement forward sexually? What do they need to be able to talk about? What should they have touched on with each other?
Oh, I think that's great. There's obviously issues around consent and boundaries. I think there's also the taboo. It's like what is hidden. That's an interesting place to go. It might not be the first place you go. I think just basic things of what we like, and those conversations can move into practices. There's a really nice model from Betty Martin. I don't know if you've heard of the Wheel of Consent.
Mm-hmm.
So this has, it really makes it clear, like, what are we doing? Are we taking in this moment, or are we giving? And just having a clarity, like, who is doing the active part of the action, and who is the one receiving the gift, and who is the one kind of giving the gift in a way. And I think playing with that, because when we go into that sexual union, we're kind of doing all of them all at once, and we're not quite sure who's doing what. So slowing it down, having those conversations, and taking that role in each of those four quadrants helps us to start to realize what we like, what we might be averse to. I realized in my relationships, I was really enjoyed giving, but I actually find it quite hard to receive. And it relates to my life as well. And so it was really powerful for me to actually really receive. There was some part of me which felt like I didn't deserve to receive, actually. So I think playing with those things, having those conversations about consent. Also, if you're going to move into, I guess, agreements, like very often we have in people who might be polyamorous in the Tantra scene as well. And so if you're moving into areas like that, or you're exploring new things, I think it's good to have agreements which help you to feel safe. Because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to have a good experience, and you're not really going to be able to open up to it. So I feel safety is super important at the start, and it's a good place to expand from. So
the problem of receiving, I relate to for sure. I've always been the kind of person who wants to end a massage really quickly. I'm like, all right, that was enough, because I'm very sensitive to energy, so I feel it starting to build up. And you feel like, oh, well, that's plenty, all right? And I have to use my active principle to act against myself, to hold myself there, and be like, no, you're going to stay here and receive.
completely. I thought it was a Scottish thing. I thought it was like a.
Well, I'm half Scottish on my father's side. It could be.
I noticed that actually with my partner, we had a celebration for her birthday last year, and she had the capacity to celebrate, which is a similar thing, where we were playing like Happy Birthday from Stevie Wonder as a surprise in the middle of the group, and she celebrated for at least 10 minutes, just overflowing in this. Whereas I was kind of bowed down in respect, because I know I can do about 20 seconds and then it's like, okay, thank you very much, and that's enough now. Take the spotlight off me, you know. So I realized, oh, that's the capacity that I can grow in there.
That's a funny thing because, to play off like a old Scottish stereotype, but it might be that populations that are highly involved in alcoholism or other kinds of drug use are trying to mitigate that sense of being overwhelmed by energy building up.
Oh, for sure. 100%. I would really see that. I mean, we actually used to do a conscious club night in Edinburgh, or in Scotland of all places, and it was the only one where there was technically there was not meant to be any drugs or alcohol in there, and we're getting high off the music and just interaction, and it's almost like an anathema to that cultural conditioning that you need something like that to just dumb it down where we can then express ourselves. So I think that overwhelm is definitely part of it. Yeah.
Coming back to the notion of development and stages or phases, are there moments in your life where you connect to as moments where you learned something critical, or made a leap or a transformation, or moved on to a next level in your personal relationship to sexuality?
I think the first time it happened to me was that experience of the full body orgasm, where I'd actually, I mean, it's funny, I'd actually done in my back, and I was with my partner, and I was being very cautious and gentle, kind of making love, but I was also very horny at the same time, and we kind of went into that love making. Well, I was still kind of a bit I don't know if this is okay, and something just released, where actually my back, the energy or the spasm of it completely went, and I had this full body orgasm, and it was the first time that I saw that this is actually possible. I could actually really feel the energy running up the spine, and that kind of that Kundalini expression. So it's very powerful in terms of that.
Neat. Whole body experience seems to involve, in the subtle anatomy, all the centers, right? And there's a sense of, Tantra diversifying sexual energy to all of existence. But there's also this sense in which there are particular sex-oriented centers in the body, particularly the two lower centers, which I thought of when, because the lower back is right in that lower abdominal zone. So how do you relate to the sex chakras, or to sexual themed areas of the body's functionality in particular?
Well, it's interesting. There's a model, there's a woman called Mananda Sarita who uses it a lot, and I think it came from sannyasins, probably from Osho originally, which is actually talking about the polarity of different chakras. I don't know if you've come across that, but it makes sense in terms of the physiology. So the first chakra would be masculine, so it's active, so it's for the man it's active, for the woman it's receptive. Second chakra is the opposite. Third chakra is active for the man and passive. So there's really, in sexuality, it's not just the first two chakras that are interacting. There's possibility for all of those chakras connecting. So you can have penetration from the third eye. There are meditations even where you can imagine a lingam kind of penetrating a yoni at the third eye and moving energy back and forth. So I like to expand the idea of that as not just being just related to those two areas, because it also just makes us refocus like the energy towards our genital or towards that part. And yet in other sense, there's also the sense of the heaven and earth analogy, where you're drawing energy up from the earth and drawing consciousness down. And so those two things are meeting. So there's a real I would say for integral and some of those Wilbur-Combs things, where actually, as much as the ascending path is really important, the descending path into the earth and those maybe slightly more pagan, what you'd call the dark masculine and feminine, is also really important to be fully integrated, not just sitting up there in the light.
That's really intriguing, because I was going to ask you a question about how you view the difference between a model where sexual charge is built up within the individual unit, and a model where sexual energy is something from outside us that we are openly conductive to. Where does it come from? Do we produce it, or do we receive it from somewhere?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's like always subtle things you can give and receive within that, so in partnerships. But within our own body, as you start to become aware of the currents in the chakra system of Tantra, then there was this idea that you're kind of raising this energy up the chakras, up the spine to the crown, which the crown wouldn't have polarity. That's where union was. And yet in Taoist Tantra, then actually you're raising the energy up, but you're also circulating, you're also bringing it back down again. And so it's, for me, I like that because it feels like it's really integrated. It's being able to move all of that, whether it's inside or out. I mean, for sure, there's things arising in our being. I like the word. I really like this word endarkenment. I don't know if you've come across that as well. Yeah, and there's this kind of notion which I feel leads to a lot of spiritual bypassing. You know, that we don't have a body. We're a spirit kind of having a body experiencing or something like this, which makes it can be very dissociated. It's like we're these angels that wait until we're born and then we have this experience, and right, and it's one way of looking at it. So then the idea is it's almost like you're imprinting on this body. But I like this idea of emanating, like actually our consciousness is arising from this gross form. It's arising in this body, and sometimes it feels there's less of a possibility for dissociation in that it's actually something that's matter is growing into spirit rather than spirit entering matter and then leaving it again.
They're both very beautiful possibilities. You know, my mother used to use that phrase of being a spiritual being having a human experience.
Yeah.
And I can see these two sides to it. On the one hand, it can be very liberating from mortal anxiety, and it can, when you imagine yourself as that spiritual being having a human experience, it can help you really open up the body. But on the other hand, it seems to imply this subtle difference, this little gap between you and the material mortal being, and that there's this other move where you can really cross that gap, and spirit can be absolutely one with the mortal and material being.
Yeah, and I think it might have been behind a lot of the dissociation and a lot of the kind of denigration of sexuality, of the body, in some of the religious traditions, where that was imposed on people, almost that becomes lower or lesser or dirty in some way. So I feel it's a healthy one to help to re-embrace that thing that it is, you know, it is part of it all. It is, yeah.
Yeah, dirt isn't dirty. A while ago, you used the word taboo, and I'm curious about taboos. It seems to me there's a couple of different ways to take them. One is maybe like a traditional or conservative way, which is the taboo is there for a reason, right? That we, even if we don't understand the reason, we inherited this rule, and it's looking after something that we might not even understand. And it's our job to sort of sacrifice some of our personal inclinations to serve this rule because it's doing some good work for us that we don't comprehend. Now, the second way is that's nonsense. It's usually a sign of pathology. You know, if there's a taboo against sodomy, that's really hurting us male homosexuals or whatever the deal is, right? All the taboos should be renormalized instead of treated as taboo. And then there's a third category of person who says, taboo gives you extra focus, extra excitement. You know, if we didn't have these taboos, we'd have to invent some other ones so we can get close to the violation point to get that real thrill. What's your take on taboo?
I like that. Well, I mean, what you were describing was stages of the spiral there, weren't you? So it was, so on one hand, if you're at a kind of red level, or and you're moving to blue in some way, then maybe that taboo is a healthy thing of like containing impulses for individualism. And so it might depend where on the spiral. It might have different. There might be a good thing to allow that more conservative energy, or to maybe break free of that in some way. And obviously there's a kind of energy in breaking free. What it does bring to me is perversions. That's another one. But in Biodanza, they had this idea of reclaiming the instincts. So where we've got the different brains, the neocortex, the kind of most recent part, is the part that's influenced by cultural conditioning. And so that has the ability to inhibit the midbrain, which is really to do with homeostasis in some way. And also our instinctual self, like instincts which are normally there for the preservation of life. And the creator of that system described that it's probably 96 or 99% of diseases are actually mental, in terms of we're inhibiting the natural impulses of the body for health and well-being. And because we don't sleep when we're tired, we get stressed and we have a deadline and we have to push ourselves, and we don't eat what feels good for us. So we continually override those things. And when they were looking at instincts as being like the wisdom of the species, they've taken millions of years through evolution to actually the really fine-tuned messages in our body. He was seeing them as a very healthy part of ourselves. And you could say that sexuality is one of those instincts. And what happens is when we repress any of those things, when we stop it, it's not that they go away. You get a perverted form of it. So healthy aggression or expression of anger becomes violence when it's perverted. It's held in, it explodes as violence. And that's why you have to have so many wars all over the place. And sexuality in a normal kind of healthy embraced way starts to become perhaps priests touching little boys or something else, because it's not going to disappear. It just comes out under the table. So I think there's a very healthy way to release the energy that might be stuck in those taboos. There's obviously ones which have societal constraints. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to act it out. If you think of people who have impulses towards pedophilia, for example, it's not necessarily that, well, they shouldn't just be allowed to act that out, but to embrace it and to find a place for them to be able to recognize and openly talk about those feelings, or openly explore them, allows that energy to move and to integrate in some way. So I really love the ability not to repress things, but to do it. But it doesn't mean you necessarily need to act it out. And sometimes it can be stronger not acting things out, but just sitting with the feelings, what it's bringing for you, and psychologically exploring all of that. So
the idea of health and pathology and perversion and levels, they fit together in very interesting ways, because often you see something and you say, well, that's just a sign of a less sophisticated level operating in myself. But at the same time, the less sophisticated level can have a healthier or a more pathological version as well. Aggression is interesting. Aggression is often in contemporary society dismissed as a relic of a more primitive stage, but it seems to have a real role in the health of every level. And there seem to be these reciprocal ways of it going wrong. In sexuality, for example, a person who can't get in touch with their aggression maybe can't reach past themselves to embrace the other, or can't defend themselves, or submits to things they're not comfortable with that will breach their integrity. And on the other hand, there are people who have just insane over-the-top flare-ups and attempts to dominate and get really angry around sexuality. So there's these twin difficulties in not integrating our aggression. But what do you think is key to integrating our aggression so that it's part of our full spectrum showing up for sexuality.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying on that. And I can see both definitely true. When I'm hearing you say the aggression is a healthy, I'm almost feeling boundaries. I'm almost feeling that ability to say no, where someone might have swallowed their no so many times and gone along with things that didn't feel right. And therefore getting in touch with a sense of aggression actually helps them to find that place where they can set limits and set a boundary so they can grow safely. When you were talking about the aggression as in like that flaring up, for me that sounds like protector pieces, or where there's some hurt underneath and they're defending something, maybe not consciously, but there's something to look at underneath that, where it just becomes, underneath that is some sadness or some hurt or some trauma, probably. I would imagine trauma in those cases, but they might not be so aware of it. So I think that can often be a very key sign to something deeper.
You mentioned pedophilia, very charged topic. Obviously, from the species point of view, there's something weird about being sexually connected to people that aren't sexually ready. And at the same time, our ancestors did a lot of that. They were breeding at a much earlier age. So it's a very gray area in some sense. It brings up a lot of charge for people. And some of that charge is individuals' internal upset about their own childhood and sexuality and that. And then some of it is a very natural impulse to prevent children from being further traumatized by having energy and information and engagements come too soon and out of their control. But what's your take on sexual education then? Because people who have an expanded notion of sexuality, it's not always obvious how much of that should be communicated to children and at what stage and in what form. When is it too soon and when is it too late to be helpful?
Well, I think it's really important to allow the questions and allow the curiosity. We have this, I think in this day and age, children know a lot more about this stuff than we imagine, and they're having these conversations, and they have the capacity to find pornography on the internet and these things. So I knew of one school where it was a big topic amongst the parents. What should we do? Like these kind of questions around pornography. And if it's already arising in the child, if it's already arising in them, then they're ready to speak about it. So I would let them introduce it, not necessarily hide away these things. And the curious thing happens that I think they end up watching a porno video together in this school. They are curious about certain things, so they end up watching it when it's kind of tucked away, as like when they get the sense that there's something not okay about that, or it's a little bit secretive, we can't be open, then it brings more curiosity to it. When it's just like, okay, yeah, check this out, then the children really, it's like, okay, that's great. And then they wanted to go and play with their like Barbie or whatever the thing was they had in the playground. It moved from one to the other, the interest, and it was like, oh, that's interesting. That's doggy style, and here's the Pokemon, So that opened my eyes to a lot of things. I'm not an expert. My partner, Ria, kind of works more sexuality and education in that way. But
good. Well, I hope we'll be able to have a conversation with her about that. Yeah. I just was thinking about, when I was a kid, I was part of the tail end of the last generation for whom pornography came in magazines. I got my hands on one and I very cleverly put it under a towel on my shelf. And then the next day, my mother starts asking me questions to differentiate erotica from pornography. So I realized, to my horror, that she's obviously found it. And I did nothing to really hide it. And I have to answer these questions, and I do my best. But what I found was, when I engaged with that pornography, it had a much more balanced intellectual sensibility, because of answering these questions for her in a kind of philosophical manner. It ended up causing me to bring some of that intelligence to my viewing of it. Oh, so wow. I was much more curious and analytical than I might otherwise have been because of that conversation, I think.
Wow. Well, I think that's amazing, and I think things like learning how to touch oneself at an appropriate age, and learning kind of like the basics of pleasure and beyond just the kind of birds and the bees kind of biology that I got at school. I don't know if it's changed much from there, but I think bringing this open discussion around those things I think it is happening more in schools, certainly in more westernized places. I see regression in places like Poland is actually going slightly backwards in terms of that, but in general, I think there's this more openness to talk about these things and to share experiences, and I think that's a positive thing. Yeah.
How, like, from a cultural point of view, as well as an individual point of view, how important is it to, treat pleasure as a real value? Because there've been a lot of cultures where pleasure was part of the opposite of spiritual growth and development. And certainly with the exception of a few pockets of aristocrats over the centuries, most people have received no education in pleasure, no hedonic intelligence. They don't really know how to love or receive touch, or even, customize their drinking in a way that gives them positive results rather than negative results. Pleasure seems to be missing from our educational system.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that. And it's so funny because how can pleasure be it's a good thing, isn't it? That's what the word means. And yet it can be kind of demonized. I think the way it gets demonized is the fear of pleasure. And I think the fear is of people losing consciousness. So maybe that's the place where energy and consciousness meet within Tantra. That it's almost like the fear of orgasms, the fear of going mad. It's the fear of being so overwhelmed by something that we will do crazy things, that our values might get thrown out the window. Maybe our relationship agreements get lost. So I think that's where the fear comes in. And I think politically and religiously, it's probably been used as a way to control people, because when people are very free and very much in pleasure, it's much harder to impose strict rules upon them. They become a bit of a rebellious bunch. So so pleasure is an amazing thing to explore, and also meeting that pleasure with awareness is where the growth edge would be for me. So not just getting lost in the pleasure, but it's like really staying with it and really staying conscious in that is where I think a lot of things start to open up. And
the notion of growth in sexuality seems to imply that there was something not as good in the past, right? We're moving forward toward a nicer, richer, more open sexuality. We're moving away from a more closed down one where we were making something that we will retroactively think of as mistakes. And a lot of us look back on a lot of sexual mistakes, things that maybe they were exciting at the time, but we wouldn't want to make them now. What do you think's key to learning from our past sexual mistakes? How do we assimilate that more deeply so that we can instinctively take it forward with us?
Well, they uncover a lot of things, don't they? Like every experience is really valid, and we have to grow through this. So I don't see anything as necessarily wrong. We might look back on certain things and wish they hadn't happened, but there's always some gift underneath any experience, really. So transcend and include is the motto, isn't it? So I think that's the way to really see the value, because if we haven't had experiences of maybe our boundaries being crossed, we might not really know what it is to have boundaries. So even though it might seem a negative experience, then we'll really know the importance of boundaries because of that. So
I guess I'm curious about, like, on the one hand, we can definitely frame it in ways where it served us and we integrate it into our story going forward. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a dimension, an affective dimension of how do we suffer from it properly, even if it was completely appropriate for the moment we were in and we can fold it into our journey. Is there a way of saying, that's That's the thing I was doing or keep doing that I feel like is thwarting me now. And how do I suffer from that intelligently? How do I be remorseful in the right way rather than remorseful in a way that is based on shoulds or shuts me down or traps me in a shame loop or something? How do I really take on the pain of my own previous limited nature in a way that serves me rather than thwarts me?
I think you answered it when you said like to take that. I mean, that's why I don't like the idea of shoulds, because I think they really stand in the way of that. I think when we can remove that and just embrace each experience, then we can really integrate it. It's almost like the kind of shame and I think shame is a massive one, I think, around sexuality and those experiences. I think those things stand in the way from us really incorporating them into our being. So it does stay like a shadow piece that's outside of the boundary of ourselves. So I think being able to just really honestly and nakedly look at things. It might be something that we did where we might have hurt someone else, or we've acted in ways that we wouldn't be proud of now. But that shame will stop us from really accepting that. So when we can just fully accept it as this is something that happened, I wouldn't choose to do this now necessarily, but I can really feel it nakedly and feel the pain of that. Then the natural responses to that, I trust, would just emerge. So, yeah.
That's a very beautiful trust to have. Let me think if there's any other random questions I wanted to ask. Is there an advantage in terms of physical health or alchemical energetic transformation to the consumption of sexual fluids?
Oh, yeah, I would say yeah. Well, I think in terms of amino acids and things, it's probably as good as any kind of protein bar out there. So definitely so. It's got all the stuff that you want. And I mean, this is a personal belief, but I do feel energetically there is a kind of energy in that which is it's very powerful, and I've had experiences of that myself, and partners have also. And so I would say yeah. I mean, there's
Okay.
I mean, there's ejaculate.
On that, yeah, go ahead.
There's also like Amrita, the kind of which would be kind of the nectar of the gods in a way. It's described as that it does have a certain energetic thing, and I think when there's a lot of rituals within Tantra where they'd use bodily fluids in some way, also the bloods. A lot of them are quite secret. My experience of those, and it's also to do with the setting and everything else, but it was very powerful. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to explain it all, but my experience is that there's something there in that. Yeah.
Obviously, you appreciate Osho's work a great deal.
Mm.
Who else do you personally look to as either great figures in terms of sexuality or people who helped move us forward culturally or intellectually, or help deepen the richness of our collective understanding of sexuality?
Well, there's some beautiful there was Gorak, I think, was it the 13th 14th century, and this is in the temples around Khajuraho in India, and they had a very liberated you can see the expression in the art in the temples. It's all these incredible positions and erotic forms, and apparently their society used to live by the river and was very kind of relaxed in the sexuality and the meditation. It was kind of almost like this, it's looked upon almost as a nirvana period. It might not have been, but it's very easy in retrospect to think of that. But this is an amazing place to visit, and some of the teachings around that are very beautiful as well. I believed, I like David Deida, we touched on him earlier. I feel he has an incredible consciousness. There's one part where I feel like he slightly tries to shame people from second into third stage that I don't really agree with. But aside from that, I think he's bringing a lot of I feel he's probably a little bit ahead of his time. And yet there's so many fantastic traditions and teachers that are undiscovered a lot because they don't have the marketing resources of like a Westerner. So like this, we have all these Tantra teachers now who are fantastic marketers but might not know so much, and yet there's people in India like the Baal mystics who are really fascinating. There was like a tantric sect that had to go underground because they were getting persecuted, and so they became these musicians, and they have these songs which have different meanings. So there's a kind of surface level meaning, and then there's a yogic meaning, and then there's like a tantric secret teaching underneath. And so some of these people are just incredible to be around.
Yeah, I appreciate them. I'm reading some of Lee Loswick's books right now. School inherits a lot of the Baal traditions into their music and sexual practices.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
What do you say to somebody who, when the concept of bringing more consciousness or intentionality or practice to their sexual life comes up, they draw back and feel like that's a danger to the very thing that they like about sexuality, which they think of as spontaneous or semi-conscious? They like the beginnings of relationships. They like to be in intoxicated states. They like a flow that overwhelms them. And they're afraid that the very thing they value about it will be lost if they start to apply awareness and intention and practice to their sexual life.
And it might be, but that's growth, isn't it? It's that we do outgrow things in life, so it probably will happen. But I guess I would try and find a way to include that, because it's not that it has to look a certain way. I think anything that starts to become a barrier, then you'd want to include it in some way that you can have all that, and the amount of pleasure that you can have in tantric sex and in some of these practices is like nothing they might have ever experienced before. It's like what they had before was like peanuts compared to this. So I guess a reassurance, but I think it's important to be able to put things in people's language, to find the language that they resonate with, to find what their needs and wants are. And that would be part of the tantric practice anyway. It's like, what are the fears? What are the needs? What are the desires? So when you can include all of those things, then, I mean, it's very integral, isn't it? Just include it all.
Beautiful. Is there anything else that you find really exciting about this field, or that is at the forefront of this field, that I haven't asked you about yet?
Well, something interesting was when I was working with Biodanza, was that they had these lines of development, which was very similar to integral actually, but they were based on like proto-vivencias, like early experiences in the womb or early experiences in life. And they have these 5 lines. So there's affectivity as one, there's creativity, vitality, transcendence, and sexuality. And what was interesting for me was really seeing how this movement of the nervous system from parasympathetic to sympathetic created this integration, created this crystallization of these lines. So they would grow through this pulsation. And you can think about it in terms of identity. There's like a forming of identity and a dissolution of identity. And the experiences I had in Biodanza were beautiful, because they would take sexuality as, you'd have sexuality in your identity, where it's like, I like you. You maybe find someone to do an exercise with because they are, if my preference was towards women, it's because they're a woman and they look this way and they have this hair and these breasts and the smell and that real kind of exciting energy like that. It's like, this is my identity, chooses you in this identity. But there'd also be these experiences of disillusion, what they called undifferentiated sexuality. And feeling out the importance of this is where you'd be kind of in trance states within a group. And there's almost like that dissolving of boundaries through the caress. The sense of self starts to dissolve. This boundary of me begins to kind of loosen a little bit, and you go into this kind of group trance stage where there's this very powerful sexuality, which is deeply healing, but it's not specifically to do with the identity of myself or the other person. It could be a man of 80 that I would not sexually find attractive necessarily, but in that kind of group, maybe someone's touching me in that way, and it's those things don't matter anymore. It is almost like that Mahamudra oceanic experience where you're dissolving into something larger. So those experiences are very powerful for me.
When you're talking about the switching back and forth between those two aspects of the autonomic nervous system, I was thinking about, primitive human spirituality, which very often involves excited states, whether it's, dance or the berserkers in war, things like that. And then there's sort of the last few thousand years of these axial age traditions that have a spirituality of calmness. Many have tried to move away from stimuli in order to get to this state. And then this other idea of this sort of tantric idea of shifting back and forth between a spirituality of calmness and a spirituality of excitement, and seeing what that brings us all together.
Yeah, I feel that it's one of the tantric practices is to have that active lovemaking in a partnership for however long, you really moving the energy, however long that lasts. Maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 20 minutes. Then you stop and you just drop into the valley. So the peak excitement and then into the valley for the same amount of time. And then you start the excitement again. And you can keep moving with that. You can have multiple peaks and valleys. It's really great for people who might have problems with premature ejaculation. Then you take the excitement to a thing and then you stop and it relaxes down. And then you go again, and it helps people to last longer. But there's also very deep spiritual experiences that are happening in that. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's plenty for anybody who's been watching and listening. It's been a very rich conversation, James. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure to use that word again.